Movies are certainly very important, but they'd be nowhere without someone to hit that little record button on the camera. And with me today is that person that hits the little record button on the camera, Mike Magilnick.
How's it going?
Very good. Um, so you're a cinematographer, and obviously I was being a little glib, but it's a lot of work being a cinematographer. That's why I hate having to do like my own camera work for anything that I'm recording for YouTube or what have you. But tell us a little about yourself and where'd you get your start?
So my name is Mike Magilnick. I've been a cinematographer for a little over 20 years. Started out doing like public access stuff, working as a camera operator and a technical director for a public access studio and doing some like on location multi-camera stuff. And then I transitioned from that into doing um, like small business commercials and local ads and whatnot, and then went off to college and got a little more education in it. Started working on narrative productions. Switched into G&E for a while to just learn about the vast technical art of lighting, which I really took off with and loved, and I still think that it's one of the most impactful elements of cinematography is like and the story building and crafting a tone and an atmosphere. And then transitioned back into cinematography when the time felt right, and I felt like I had more to contribute from that end of things. And I've been doing that pretty solidly since I want to say like 2014, 15, more so cinematography than anything else.
And how did you meet up with Rishi Gandhi and become a part of the beasts we carry?
So we were introduced through a friend that I had gone to high school with, and he knew through college. And she connected us, and it took a little while for us to find something that we could actually collaborate on, because at that point, he was doing more color work than directing as his focus, and that was the easiest way for us to kind of find some sort of commonality or way to get into each other's ecosystem with things. So I had, oh boy, I'm trying to remember what the actual first project that we did was. That might not be as crucial, but we've done a few shorts. I think he's done a couple features that I've shot in that capacity. So he and I have started to collaborate more closely on what we like aesthetically, the different technical values that we appreciate, and then also having a good laugh over the really terrible stuff that we find out in the wild and that we don't like. So that kind of led to this collaborative nature where he wanted to get back into the director's seat and bring me onto a project where he and I could collaborate from the ground up on crafting an image rather than strictly within the colorist DP relationship, and really have something of his own that we could bring to life.
Now you say talk about lighting being very important, and this is going to be a film set in a school, and I can't help but think about any time I was in school as a kid, and it's nothing but the harsh, fluorescent lighting. I don't know if it's different in schools these days, but this is a period piece, so it's going to be like how I remember with all the harsh fluorescent lighting. What comes into play when you're trying to establish a visual language that feels true to the setting, but you want certain emotions to be heightened, whether fear, dread, and what have you.
So I think that the first thing that we've kind of talked about when it came to the tonality was we started looking at some other comparable works that we valued for the spirit of what this should be, period aside. And then from there, we kind of described to each other different ways, not specifically talking about units or anything, because that's not a language I think that he necessarily needs to speak, but we talk about more like the tone and the emotion, and then from there, I'm kind of looking at works that I feel parallel a lot of what we're talking about that are more from a certain time period, or to me feel like they're representative of that. But I don't know that we're necessarily uh, really trying to target in a lighting aspect this specific year or era or anything like that in such a naturalistic way, just because there's such a theatricality to the story and this sort of fantastical. portrayal of some of these characters that I think that kind of makes it that's the primary drive in like what it should look like and how we shape it over necessarily being true to like a certain year. Does that make
Uh,
sense?
yeah, I get what you mean.
Yeah.
Um, so this is not your first horror film. I know that you've done work on a project called Founders Day, and was that your first horror film or horror type film, or was there one prior to that?
There's a bunch prior to that. Um, Founders Day was, I think, my third or fourth horror feature with that particular production company. Um, Probably, I think it was my, uh, that might have been my, like around my 20th feature. And uh, I'd say maybe half have been something in the horror or suspense thriller kind of world. Um, I like doing dramas and comedies and all that other stuff. I've shot a couple musicals. They're all super different in nature, which is really fun, and you get to pull different tools out of your bag for each of these different things. But working specifically within like a horror genre, there's some interesting freedoms that you can find or negotiate outside of what you can in maybe other genres, or maybe that's unfair to say, but it's different, and like there are things that an audience will either be looking for or accept easier than something in a different genre. But that other genre might have also different things that you can get away with you might not be able to get away with in horror, for example. Um, but it's an interesting sort of way to build a story when you know right off the bat there are certain things that you want to position your audience for within like a certain mentality or psychological structure, and like figuring out collaborating with all the other departments on how to achieve that and like what it's going to take from each of us to really make sure that that comes across properly is really important. But Rishi seems to have like this really clear sort of directive on what he's looking for and how he wants to shape a lot of these scenes, and what the clear intention emotionally is for not only each of the characters but how he wants the audience to feel and what he wants the camera to be doing to amplify or um, help to convey that as strong as possible.
Now, are you doing storyboards for certain shots to figure out the composition ahead of time, or is it sort of like just jotted down as sort of a basic sort of way in the script in the shooting script, and you're figuring it out sort of as you go based on the space, or a little from column A, a little from column B?
Yeah, it's kind of um it can vary based on director to director. I generally like to at least make some sort of a shot list. Storyboarding, I feel in a lot of ways can be a little too restrictive, and coming from a lot of commercial work, you can end up getting people falling in love with something that just may not be achievable on the day, depending on what you have for location parameters. So shot listing tends to be the most unifying thing. It gives the AD an idea of how many pieces this scene might be, how big we're picturing it being. It gives me a way to kind of convey with the director on like some of the coverage types, but then like the specificity of where's the camera going to be, what height's it going to be at, all that kind of stuff. For a lot of scenes, we tend not to do. However, on this particular project, Rishi actually does have a storyboard artist, and we have gone through and drawn out, or at least roughly sketched a large portion of our scenes. And I think that that difference in workflow is really coming from that this project has a lot of work with kids, with minors, and a lot of that work also includes stunts. So between the timing and scheduling constraints that we're going to have with working with minors, accompanying with that we have stunts we have to fit into these times, it's really just going to get us all on the same page in a lot clearer of a sense. Now, that being said, we've done one round of storyboarding. Now we've kind of locked in our location. We're adapting some of our script pages to reflect what we actually have at this location. And then we're going to go back and refine some of these storyboards to better and more accurately reflect what we actually have for situations, locations, spatial relationships, things like that. Things that we can kind of more dial in our blocking ahead of time now that we know the space it lives in.
Um, So we think, I said, do you work on horror films? But, you say horror films could contain multitudes, a Black Christmas is not the same sort of thing as a Videodrome, which is not the same sort of thing as The Ring, which is not the same sort of thing as Cuckoo. Um, what goes into sort of figuring out a visual language that can feel tense, feel, suspenseful to the audience, but is also true to the tone of the film. Who are you looking to as your sort of like guiding star in terms of figuring out how a shot should look in a horror film?
I think this is probably my weakest area as like a filmmaker when it comes to like reciting names and specific works and things like that. I have visual tendencies and things I like and dislike, but I'm terrible with names, and it's hard for me to like kind of say like, oh, this is reminiscent of this person's work in this film from this year. So I think it really does come from a more emotional place. Talking with Rishi about like how he wants an audience to feel, and then kind of spawning out a few ideas, spitballing. Like, for example, I think we've talked about wanting to maybe have the first couple scenes of this almost feel like a different movie to reflect, this change that happens to this character when they're watching this event unfold, and how violently it just shifts a lot of parameters of his life. So, with that being said, right off the bat, we now have two different movies in the aesthetic values that we're designing. But then when it comes to like more specifically to your question, like how do you decide what you want this shot to look like? I feel like that's more of a cumulative effort from, our aspirations of the things we're looking at for comparables and what we like. And then there's the reality of this is what our schedule ends up looking like. This is what our budget ends up looking like as far as, what tools and um, lights we can work with and where they can be positioned. And it all kind of comes down to this really all-encompassing thing. Like there's a lot of logistics that weigh in on every decision we end up making. Um, so it's almost like that desire for how it's going to look continues to evolve really until we push the button. Uh, and even then there's some elements within post-production that can help to continue to shape that, but Rishi and I are both big purists with trying to do what we can in camera and really restrict what is being relied on in post for. So we're crafting these aesthetics out of, kind of hopes and dreams, and then seeing where we can land with what we can actually accomplish on the day. But that being said, we do have very clear vision of what we're targeting, and I feel that it's not unrealistic. Like, I already understand where we're going to land roughly for budgeting and what we're going to be up against for scheduling just by the nature of how many days we're looking at and the kind of work we have to do. So there is a more, sort of cohesive and thought through look even before we come down to the variables of the day of what we're trying to create. But it's hard to nail down like who it's coming from or like what inspirations we're pulling from. That's probably not the answer you guys wanted, and that's not super helpful. I feel like I rambled in there for a little bit
No,
too.
no, no, don't worry about it. And what you mentioned coming in within budget. Now I know
Mm.
and I know that horror movies in particular and low budget filmmaking, getting shots in can be very catch as catch can. I worked on one film where let's say the cameras were borrowed. They were returned at the end, but let's say they were borrowed so that we could get the shots in. What goes into the methodology of getting, your shots in when you were working, you were up against the clock and you were trying to get things in, under or on budget?
You talking about like actually on the day, like once many decisions have already been made, like and we show up, and how do we make sure that we meet our days? Or are you more asking like how are we defining the box in which we're working within as well?
I would say defining the box, knowing
Like
knowing how to work
how do
within
you
the
assess the project's needs and
yeah,
what is in its infrastructure to actually accomplish,
working within
more or less.
limitations.
Yeah. Um,
Do you shoot for
so
coverage?
I think that one of the biggest things is you assess what your weakest points are going to be. And that's not necessarily saying anything about like where we fall in terms of budgeting or that there's anything wrong with the production, but every production has some sort of pitfall, something that's working against it right off the bat. Even if you have all the money in the world and all the time in the world, something is going to chip away at your ability to really make it the thing that, not the thing that you want, but like the thing that it ultimately could have been in some mystical, fantasy way. Um, for us, the reality is that we have a finite number of days because we're working in a short form factor. It's just investment wise hard to achieve a huge budget, which will give us unlimited time. So right off the bat, we have time. The script is modeled around minors, which means our time is now cut down having minors. So I think, don't quote me on this. This isn't my world. I'm not an AD. I think we only have minors for like 8 hours or 6 hours. I know it changes depending on what time of day we're using them too. Like I know they can't work past midnight no matter what time their call is. So there's other restrictions. And we're shooting days, so we can maximize the amount of time we have them for, but right off the bat, our days are shorter. So that means we're strategizing on how to use the rest of that time, whether it's loading in, pre-lighting, working out blocking with like some of the adults as well, because the script is partially adult, partially children. And then beyond uh the number of days and children, there's equipment restrictions too. So, like, if our budget doesn't allow for cranes or rigging units outside, now we have to work with lighting from inside, which means we're going to move a little bit slower because we have to dance lights around the location as opposed to maybe making a space that's a little more 360 friendly, which is, I think, considering the children aspect of this, what we're more hoping that every location that we walk into at this facility, even though we're shooting at a practical location, every location can be lit in a pretty 360 ready to go sort of way. So there's very minimal tweaking we need to do shot to shot. Our base is set for us, which achieves the ability to move much faster and get more shots. And also, if we end up running ahead in some way, be more creative with the shots that we're getting and feel a little more like we can breathe. So when kind of looking at what Rishi presented to me for a script, those are the things I first identify and start to try to develop lighting strategies, realistic look expectations, tonality, and even like going as deep as some shot designs. Like, is there a limitation to how complicated a single frame might be? And then some of this I kind of revisit when we start casting too, because especially dealing with minors, their acting range and their attention span can vary drastically. So we could have a shot in mind that is somewhat intricate. And if that shot ends up being toward the back end of a day, schedule wise, just coincidentally, and it has to be at the back end of this day, are they going to have the attention span and focus still at that point in the working day for them to be able to still perform that? So, these are continuous hurdles to assess and decide how to overcome throughout the entirety of it. But really setting your appetite at the beginning to match what you think the production will be able to sustain is really your first uh, big challenge. And I think that really only comes from having done it a bunch and having experience and, you know, unfortunately having failed on some other occasions maybe, or seeing other productions fail, or having friends and you're all sharing a beer and you hear all their horror stories about something that was just doomed from the beginning. So that can help to inform you as you're starting to move through your own projects and identify those things earlier on, helping everyone kind of get over them.
Basically, it sounds like you have to plan as best you can, but
Stay
at the end
nimble.
of the day, you have to be flexible.
Yeah. And the amount of flexibility you can retain, I think, is a really good measure of how successful you can become within whatever you're making, because there's gonna be curveballs.
And well, I'm sure that public access television definitely had to have been good training for that sort of be flexible mentality.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you're dealing with, very limited equipment, very rigid sort of structures on like what can and can't be paid for because of just the legality surrounding some public access stuff. Um, so, there's a lot to navigate. And I mean, I started at that when I was like 13 and didn't really understand a lot of the business side of things and started going out on locations, lighting scenes and setting up cameras and, not really understanding some of the infrastructure that I was missing at that point. So, I mean, from a certain perspective, you're only exposed to a certain set of tools and a certain way of doing things at a time, and you build upon that. But those initial steps, you don't even realize what else there is and how much more there could be.
So in this film, we're working with a conventional sort of setting, a school. Um, but at the same time, we have these unusual creatures that share the space with the students. How do you see, lighting or doing the shots in a way that reflects simultaneously this fantastical nature, but also this very realistic, down to earth sort of setting?
Mm. I think for me, there's this kind of transition that occurs where when the beasts start to come out, that it's from a lighting and a texture perspective, we're kind of leaving the reality side of things and introducing a bit more of a heightened sense of almost how so when we're talking about like how to really develop the like difference between this fantastical element and the real world nature and the grounded reality of the situation that Raju is in. One of the things that I think for me is I'm considering is that when these beasts come out in their more true form and people start to turn on him, we're really seeing the world through Raju's perspective of things. So if Raju is in a more terrifying environment and he's feeling attacked, then the lighting reflects not necessarily the reality of the world he's in, but the way that he's sort of seeing it. So, like, if we have a scene in a classroom prior to this incident happening, that might feel like that first movie that's a little brighter and a little more cheery and a little more pleasant because that's the world he lives in right now. He's got friends, everything's good. And then this happens and his friends start to turn on him. And now everything's getting darker. It's feeling more claustrophobic. It's more contrast. So, there's that's kind of how we're negotiating the way that the world kind of presents itself is really it's from his perspective. It's how he's viewing these things. Because if we were to ground ourselves within a reality of um, more naturalistic lighting or like trying to render these spaces in a more real tone, I feel like that limits us in a way that's almost a disservice to the story in some capacity or in some ways. Um, so to really lean into the fantastical element and like say, no, this is Raju's story. This is how he is perceiving these things because he's seeing the beasts within. They're not real. They're manifestations, but they're not well, I don't want to say they're not physically there because obviously there's things that happen, but like it is his perspective on the situation. So that allows us to really step away from the naturalistic and reality tone and lean into what feels appropriate for where he is psychologically.
So the camera is not sort of the it's not the fly on the wall in a sense. It is
No.
the emotional. It is an extension of Raju and his
Yes.
emotional state of being.
Yeah, and these are all decisions that are being informed out of the script because none of these decisions are right or wrong. There are so many different ways you can approach any script and any story working with any director. There's preferences that people have, there's baggage people bring into the project, good and bad. And I think that a lot of this not a lot, all the decisions that we are making so far on this project are feeling very well informed by what we're getting from the script. You know, it's kind of telling us what it wants to be and how it wants to be reflected and rendered out to an audience. But a different team with this same script might have a whole different approach. They might not lean into the fantastical. They might choose different colors to use. Like there's so many different ways you can approach any of this. So it's really just like this cumulative nature of like the artists that are involved and like how they feel a lot of this should be conveyed and brought to life. And you know, Rishi's been really nurturing with a lot of these ideas and has brought some amazing ideas of his own to the table with like different color schemes and having drawings ready, as well as like reference frames from other projects and things he's really liking that are helping to kind of bring all the other contributors in on a more succinct page of this is what this movie is going to be and this is how it's going to render itself.
I was thinking earlier about George Romero, how he sort of cut his teeth on local television commercials and sort of took this sort of like pragmatic but very much on a budget sort of approach with when he was shooting Night of the Living Dead or Dawn of the Dead. You just get your cameras in place, you just shoot for coverage, and you just do it all in editing. But this is sort of a different sort of kettle of fish in terms of you have like these sort of in-camera effects, you have these strange creatures, you have this heightened state of emotion.
Yeah, I think that that's a great example of just different ways people like to work. Like I don't think that um that's something that's really in my vocabulary too much is just like let's just put cameras here and hope something happens that way. I feel like, you know, that's great for like doc style stuff and some projects may be in that sort of fashion, but like I feel like when you're entering a narrative world, um there's, at least in my personal preferences, a lot more of a deliberate intention that I like to see within a lot of how these frames are crafted and almost every decision that's put into what we're doing. Not to say that every decision has to take a long time to come to a result, but like I want to believe that in the narrative space over others, there is more intention for a lot of stuff. Granted, within that same conversation, though, I've heard people talking about like, oh, well, the house was blue because it represented this feeling. And it's like, no, it's because the location we found was blue and that's the color of the house because we can't afford to paint a house.
Right.
So, you know, there's the intention you can control, but then there's other things that you just get really lucky with. But I'd like to think that as much as we can, we're really imposing the will we want on the story.
The best laid plans of mice and cameramen.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, can you tell me a little bit about the first horror film that you worked on?
Mm.
Is that look because you have a hard time remembering or because you're not at liberty to discuss about what went down?
I mean, I remember the more recent ones more vividly, but like, I'm trying to even remember what the first one was. And then there's also this thing where when you do too many of a certain type of thing in a row, you start to get nervous. You're going to be known as the horror guy,
You're not so
the car
interested in being
guy.
typecast
Right. Well,
or
and I had this
type
streak.
hired.
I had this streak, basically from post-COVID till now, where like I feel like the majority of my features have been horror. And I'm starting to get a little nervous that that's like becoming a thing. But I've done, I mean, since COVID, I've also done a musical and several dramas, a comedy. So like it's diversified, but the biggest ones, the ones that have like gone to theaters and had the biggest distribution have been horror. So they're the most in the spotlight. Um,
And so you notice a sort of uptick um post so let's say what is this around 2021, 2022,
yeah, but
23?
21 mostly, like when stuff started to open back up and whatnot. I think it's partially a response, a response. It's not like the way the industry is going, but it's a response to the way the industry has kind of been turning with like streaming a little bit and just a flooding of content because the horror industry is unique in that the fan base is so built in and the return is a little more not guaranteed. Nothing's guaranteed. It's still kind of becoming this thing where like breaking even has become the gold standard of like, can we do it? Forget profits. So it seems like because horror, whether it's good or bad, there's a market for it somewhere. It will find an audience. So that's become, I think, a little bit more of a safe bet when it comes to like projects getting greenlit. Um, so that's just why it's, I think, been a little more prevalent, at least for me. And I've seen a lot more horror films, I think, being more largely distributed and like having more theatrical runs than I feel like I saw prior to COVID
And
and
there's
like
always
streaming.
Tubi.
Yeah. So like the first movie I had in theaters wound up getting snatched up as a Tubi original shortly after. Um, and that was a horror film. Uh, that was that was a lot of fun. I mean, the horror, there was a lot of overnights. It was shot in 12 days, 10 days, to do a feature with a good amount of stunts. We had a day where we lit a guy on fire. We've had oh boy, that was really cool. We were just kind of running around a summer camp for 10, 11 days, treating it almost like a back lot. Like we had this main stretch that brought us like to most of our locations, and they're all like different cabins or different camping areas that were all like along this one stretch of land. And it was really challenging because we had a very fixed, tight schedule, and whenever we had rain or bad weather, we just kind of had to deal with it. But the whole story takes place over the course of one night. Luckily, you don't perceive any rain really in the film when it plays out, but like there are days where it is pouring, like dumping buckets on us. And then there's other days where it's just dry and hot but it's all at night, so really through the craft of lighting, you can kind of try to hide some of that stuff, but also just like the look we had predetermined of how we are going to make this film, like how we were going to make it look, meant putting lights in certain areas, which didn't really hide the fact that it was raining. So that became its own thing to fix and solve. But um, yeah, all in all, that was the horror genre itself is a lot of fun to work within. And I think that there's a very special sort of approach to a lot of how that goes that I'm excited to still be learning some of the tropes. And because I'm not really a big horror fan on my own, I'm starting to watch more horror films because of the ones I'm shooting. And as I'm introduced to new tropes by the directors, and they're like, oh, well, we want to kind of frame it this way because we want people to really be looking into shadows and we want to misdirect a lot of things. And as I'm learning a lot of these elements, I'm finding them more and more in different movies, and I'm starting to realize, like, oh, this is how that's structured. And when we're watching a movie to prep for shooting something, we'll break down how a scene works and really figure out what are the components of this. Is this a camera thing? Is this a lighting thing? Is this a sound design thing? Like, what is really driving the emotion in this moment? And we've discovered a lot of times the camera work is really basic. The lighting may not even be very scary or dramatic, but it's a editing and a sound thing. Or it's the other way around. There's no sound and it's one take, but it's something about how the contrast is built in this frame and that the camera's moving very slowly, that it's giving you this anxious feeling. So lots of different ways to mimic these emotions on screen and just, different approaches with different projects.
You mentioned earlier about a sort of reluctance about being known as a horror guy, quote unquote, and also learning the sort of like tropes and what have you, the visual language for horror films, and yeah, that could certainly be a precarious pit to fall down because I spent some time having a booth at Monster Palooza out west, and you definitely see your filmmakers out there that are very much just like, well, I want to make a Jason, I want to make a Nightmare on Elm Street. There's wearing your heart on your sleeve, and then there's just wearing
It's
all
hard.
your organs on your sleeve. So how do you avoid sort of like falling into those visual pitfalls, like still, having something recognizably that looks horror, but still having a visual voice that is still your own?
I think it's challenging because everything's been done to a certain extent. And especially when you're dealing with something that you're trying to pay homage to that has a fan base around it or IP surrounding it, you're going to really polarize a lot of your audience. There's going to be a lot of people that are like, they didn't do it right. Oh, I can't believe they tried this. Or people who are like, oh, I really respect that they did this. I think it really connects with this source thing that they're paying homage to. And that same execution will be interpreted both ways. And it really is frustrating because, but it's also the game. That's just what it is. So I think what you do is you go at it with the most honest artistic intention of, this is what I think serves the story best. This is a technique that works, or a line that we like, or what, because it could be a camera thing, it could be a lighting thing, it could be a line of dialogue, it could be a hairstyle. Like there's so the question you're asking can attribute or can apply to so many different attempts at so many different parts of the filmmaking process. I think if you come at it honestly with the best intentions and you think it works well, because you can try it and it doesn't work, just cut it out, change it. Either on the day if you can, find another way to do what you're trying to do. But if shoot it and you're in the editing room and you're like, oh, this isn't working the way I thought, try to just get it out of there because you're just going to get ripped apart. But if it works okay, legitimately works okay, you're still going to have people that like and dislike it. But at least then you can rest easy knowing we tried. We did the best we can. It works. It's doing what it's supposed to do. Just didn't find the audience it wanted with these people, but we did well.
Because yeah, it seems to me that horror is sort of about um, making people uncomfortable. I mean, obviously there are multitudes within it, but like one of the aspects is sort
Yeah.
of this disquieting, discomforting nature. And if you um, find yourself repeating expected things, whether narratively or visually, then is that really making anyone all that uncomfortable? If this is all rote and
No.
by the book.
Yeah, like, and that's the thing is you want to still deviate in some way, make it your own, and they, kind of cater it to whatever the story and the situation is that it's currently going to live within. So, because there's this whole other thing within the horror structuring of things, which is subverting expectations or misdirection. So, one of the films that I shot, we very specifically wanted to keep really dark shadows and pockets of darkness, leave parts of our set unlit so that you're kind of looking for things in these corners and maybe even there's an off composition of framing and it's leaving an open area where you're trying to get the audience to look in that area thinking, oh, something's going to pop up over their shoulder or something like that. But then what you can do is either doesn't happen and now you're just raising anxiety levels to lead into something else or to just sustain that anxiety level through a period of the film, or you can use that for misdirection and you do have something that's jumping out but it's coming from a different part of the frame, or it's coming there was a movie I saw last night, and there's this wide shot looking through a windshield as this person like runs to a car, and they get in the car, and then they go to start the car, and they pause for a second, they're looking out the windshield, and I feel like that shot very much designed itself in a way where you're looking deep. Granted, the screen is two-dimensional, but you're still looking deep. You're focusing further out on a smaller detail, looking for someone coming through the tree line in the distance or something, which is a great opportunity to have something close foreground pop up and really become a large portion of that frame, big jump scare. They didn't do that, but they kept that anxiety up by making you feel like something's about to happen, and then they go a different direction with it to their credit. But there's certain things that you kind of start to expect from certain frames.
Right. Yeah, you play around the audience like that. I was thinking I was watching a movie last night. The title escapes me. There's a man with a sort of mutilated hand, and he's in the
Scary movie too. Three.
basement of this bakery. So he's shot, by these ovens with fire, and it kind of frames him in this way that's sort of menacing. But he sort of in a way seduces the lead girl in it, and Moonstruck. Yeah, that was it. Um,
In it.
But I was thinking a little bit with In a Violent Nature. I'm not sure if you saw that film, but narratively it is adjacent. It is Friday the 13th, but they very deliberately shoot it not at all like that. They shoot it completely, almost documentarian at
Yeah.
times, which was an interesting thing because that could have been a very forgettable movie, but because it's done with these long takes of silence, it transforms the film into something else.
Right, which gives it its own unique thumbprint.
Right.
But there's going to be an audience that loves that, and there's going to be an audience that hates that. And I feel like that's just kind of the nature of the business we're in, too. It's the whole thing is a very subjective format, which
Right.
is why it's beautiful because you can like that makes it so much more rewarding when you have something that you create that does find its audience, that starts to get good reviews and good traction, and you feel like you have the satisfaction of having accomplished something, which in today's sort of media age is such an uphill battle in the first place. So now you've made something and you're feeling really proud. We actually did something here. And then someone watches it or multiple people watch it and they start to resonate with it and connect with it and like it. It's almost like this whole other unexpected level of it. Like that's what you want, but I feel like so many of us just don't expect a lot of things to go very far because the market's so saturated. So it's immensely rewarding when you see like a positive or a review, a negative one too. Like my wife and I actually, there's movies that I've had in theaters that she'll keep an eye out for like the without a box reviews and stuff like that. And, we'll just get drunk reading the bad ones. And, sometimes they're hilarious and sometimes they're very much pointed at me. And it's like you can tell they're speaking out of a place where they don't really know what the process is like. And they're just like, one of them was like, "Oh, they forgot the cinematography in this movie," and it's like, "Well, actually, no, we didn't." Funny enough, but it's cool.
Opinions are like
You think
assholes.
that?
Everyone's got one.
Yeah, and that's fine. Like I welcome that. I actually almost prefer looking at negative criticisms because it gives me the ability to grow. If everyone's just saying how much they love something, there's a lot to glean from that and a lot of reward you can pull from that and self-satisfaction. But you find people who don't like what you're doing, you can grow from that. You can figure out what didn't resonate with them and what didn't play well, and then you can develop your skills and approach the next scene you have that's similar in a different way and see if that works.
It's like Bob Ross said, may you never be completely satisfied, because then, if you're not satisfied, then you're always striving to do better, and that's an important lesson to keep in mind when you're filming a child's skull getting caved in.
All our projects are happy little accidents.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. I think this is a fun project and it's got a lot of uh, great creatives behind it. Um, if you have anything to contribute to the crowdfunding campaign, it's greatly appreciated on a very personal level for a lot of people. The story is very personal to Rishi. It's his experience from this monumentous event that touched everyone in some capacity. And I think that this is a very creative way to really reflect on that, and I think it's also quite relevant today as well. So if you have anything you can give, I think it would go a long way and be very appreciated.
Could not have said it better myself. Big thanks to Mike Magilnick for taking part in this interview.
Thanks for your time.